Next, about books. We begin with Olivier Todd and a discussion of his biography of French philosopher and writer Albert Camus. And then author Susanna Lassard talks about her book, The Architect of Desire, Beauty and Danger in the Stanford White Family.
The degree to which it had been out of control and destructive to others.
Now a discussion of the life and work of French writer Albert Camus. Biographer Olivier Todd discusses Camus' involvement in French politics and social issues. Mr. Todd also talks about how he wrote the book and his experiences having it translated into several languages. He's joined by members of a New York City theater group who read from a play written by Camus called The Misunderstanding. This event was held at the Algonquin Hotel in New York City.
Right here.
Can you get rid of this for me?
Well, actually, over here would be better, because people might be walking through here.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Tonight we have the pleasure to be meeting Olivier Todd, who has just written a biography of Albert Camus. And he will be reading excerpts of his books. Myself and Cyr and Bertrand will be reading excerpts of a play by Albert Camus called The Misunderstanding. And we will then have a Q&A. So you will be welcome to ask Monsieur Todd everything you've always wanted to know about Camus but never dared to ask. So, Mr. Todd was born in Paris in 1929, and he studied at the Sorbonne and at Cambridge University. He's taught for a few years before turning to journalism. He has been a reporter, a columnist, and an editor at Le Nouvel Observateur and L'Express in Paris. And he has also contributed to the Times Literary Supplement and Newsweek International and worked for the first French television channel and the BBC. He is the author of numerous books, including novels, essays, collections, and biographies. A little anecdote, Jean-Paul Sartre endorsed Todd when he first published his first novel. And Albert Camus, the book, has enjoyed a critical and a popular success in France and has recently been translated into English and has been published by Knopf. Monsieur Todd, what brought you to want to write about Camus?
Well, I think the seminal moment is probably simply my reading The Stranger when I was 15 in the Luxembourg Gardens. I lived with my mother in a flat that had been lent to us, so to speak, by a Jewish friend of ours who was on the run. And the flat was far too small for me to be able to read while my mother was giving English lessons then. So I went and read in Luxembourg Garden. And I opened the book and I got a shock, the kind of shock I think that most readers of L'Étranger have had. You know, there was something so forcible, so original, and so crisp, so fast, and yet so mysterious about the book. I don't buy a lot of academic interpretations about this book. They say that this is the meaning of L'Étranger. I don't think there's such a thing as a meaning of a masterpiece. You know, what is the meaning of Hamlet? What is the meaning, other things being equal? So that's the fundamental reason. Then I kept on reading Camus' novels and essays. At the same time, I developed a kind of vague, unconscious guilt feeling towards him because by accident I'd met Sartre. And as you know or don't know, they had a bitter quarrel in the 50s. One of the reasons why I got into this biography was that I wanted to know, how fair or unfair one had been to Camus. Apart from that, it so happens that I'm more interested and perhaps a little bit more competent about what happened in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, and say what happened in the Middle Ages in France. You know, my knowledge of French history really, like many people of my generation, starts more or less solidly in 1789. Now, another reason was that I've written a few biographies before, and the material of biographies is both testimonies. On cherche des témoins. You want to find people who knew X, Y, and Z. And I think that a kind of Freudian waiting moment, mourning, is needed. If you lose your mother tomorrow, and I come along and say, I want to write a biography of her, you're going to send me packing. You don't want to talk about her. In 20 years' time, you'll probably be able to talk more. And that was about the right moment. A lot of friends of Camus, especially unknown friends, were then willing to talk. And they did talk to me. Some of the important women of his life were still alive. There was also a simple sort of legal moral problem. It's no secret that Camus, well, had several women in his life, though I want to make it quite clear that I haven't written the love life of Albert Camus, but I've not avoided the subject. And until his second wife, Francine, died, it would have been A, indecent, and B, impossible to write this biography frankly. Now, these are some of the reasons I might have given to you if you'd asked me the question before I started, you know, when I signed the contract 7 years ago. The book, incidentally, I'd planned working 4 years, 3 years, and it's the first time I don't actually respect a contract. It took me 5 years for a variety of reasons. I wanted to write the book for reasons and causes that I discovered after I'd finished it. People pointed this out to me. Now, don't misunderstand me. You know, I know where Camus is and I know where I am, but certain things come out. I discovered, which I only knew vaguely, that he'd had a very authoritarian grandmother, very weak mother, no father, that he'd been a teacher and a journalist, and he played football, and I've never touched a football. So there were things that came out. If you want to empathize with someone, you've got to have both sympathy and a slightly critical attitude, and I felt I had both. Fundamentally, the reason is that I like a lot of his work, not all of his work. You know, I consider that things like my favorite book of Camus is The Fall. Lastly, I've always been very interested in doing portraits. I remember the first time I hit on a portrait that I thought was very good was in the Corpus Christi College Common Reading Room in Cambridge. They used to have huge portraits, which the Anglo-Saxons do very well. The Americans like the English, but not the French. Somehow, you know, French is not a language that lends itself to portraits. So when I was a journalist, I started doing a lot of portraits. And when you come down to brass tacks, a biography is a very, very long portrait. Admittedly, that one is very long because in French it's about 800 pages. And finally, I don't want to go on about this, but finally, I'm very interested in what writers put of their lives into their works. They're, roughly speaking, in a caricatural way, two critical attitudes, especially in France. On the one hand, you have the old Taine school, and in English, Sainsbury, which says, you know, everything the writer has in his life he puts into his work, and you can always explain the work by the life. Then at the other end of the spectrum, the critical spectrum, you have so-called postmodernists and structuralists who say, no, 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 you've only got texts. One text replies to another text, and what is important is the context and the intertext and the epitext. You know, these words actually exist in critical jargon. They do, and they are supposed to signify and to have meaning. Now, I'm not saying that you know, Barthes and people like that didn't bring something to criticism, but I think we're also going through a heavy mist of jargon. I happen to think that writers put a lot of their lives into their books. And in Camus' case, I was very interested. And I was able, and I think I was the first to do this, to point out that The Fall is almost entirely autobiographical, though transcended by Camus' art and his passion for literature. Now, when you discover that his wife, Francine, tried to commit suicide, and that's after that he wrote the book, I'm not saying that the book takes more value, but you look at it in a very, very, very different way. that, I think, are the main reasons why I embarked on Camus when I did.
And when you did, you say the book took 5 years to write. Was that it was difficult to track people down, or?
Well, let me say quite frankly that I don't think, it seems a bit preposterous if one's trying to sell one's biography, I don't think one can write the biography. That's why I find the sentence, the definitive biography, ludicrous. Human beings are much too complex for anybody to be able to seize them. And my thing is subtitled Une vie, a life, because it is that part of a life that I have managed to find. Now, it took me 4 years because the snowball effect got going. I'd underestimated the amount of work that had to be done. Had to do a lot of traveling. This book actually took me, and you can imagine the amount of arguing I had with my publisher for expenses. It took me from La Jolla in California to the Comintern archives in Moscow, and to Prague, and to Italy, and of course to Algeria, where I was very lucky because I managed to get in just before, you know, Torschluss panic set in, before the doors came down. So one person led to another, one document led to another, and you never know exactly, however much, whatever method you have, you're bound at one moment to go off on a tangent and to come back and to discover a document.
And what was your biggest surprise? What?
My biggest surprise? Well, there were psychological surprises. My biggest surprise was to find that I'd always thought of Camus as a lot of people, slightly arrogant, full of subjunctives. You know, subjunctive is a difficult mode in French. It's not exactly the one that workers at Renault use. I discovered how poor he'd been. I discovered that language to him, classical French, was a conquest. You know, he lived in North Africa in a very poor milieu where they spoke Patawes, which is an interesting variety of French, but it's not good French. I also discovered that this man, who was thought of as being very arrogant, was full of doubt from beginning to end. Let me just give you 2 examples. He's in his 20s, he's very sick. I also discovered that he'd been sick all his life. We knew he'd had TB, but not to that extent. And when you had TB before the war in Algeria, in Belcourt, no penicillin, nothing, no cure, the chance of your dying were 1 to 3. He was very pessimistic about his gifts, and he told his friend Claude de Fréminville, "Oh, I'm sure you can write several books, but I don't think I can even write 1 book." A month later, he would say, "I think I will write une œuvre, and it'll be in cycles, and I will start with the cycle of the absurd, and there will be a novel with a stranger, and there'll be a play, and it'll be Caligula, and there'll be an essay, the myth of Sisyphus." And this he did throughout his life. You know, then there was a cycle of the absurd, and the first man was going to be the novel of the last cycle, which would have been perhaps called le cycle de Sisyphe, about happiness and serenity. And I discovered a man who was, I'm weighing my words, anything but frivolous. Sartre, with all due respect to his genius, was very frivolous. He would start Les Chemins de la Liberté, his novel, and finish off throw it away after starting the 4th volume. He would start a long series of essays on communists and peace, stop midway. And that's the way he worked, not Camus. Camus saved everything. Now, another surprise was his correspondence, where he showed himself more perhaps than anywhere else, more than the published carnets. Now, a letter, I think, is a very interesting document because you cannot, as a researcher, vouch for the truth of what the letter says, but at least you know that when Camus is writing to his friend Urbain Polge, or to one of his many girl friends, it's a horrible expression, une de ses amies, at least he is wanting to convey what he's actually saying. Also, he happens to be a very good letter writer, very funny, very humorous, full of self-pity also, serious, dead serious. I discovered that at times he could be over-serious and even very pompous. So there part of his official persona coincided with the private personality. But, and the other surprises that I had, well, I remember one, just off the cuff like that, you know. One, must forgive me, I'm a bit jet laggy, so I have a tendency to go from one point to another. I had discovered, but this may situate a piece that I'm going to read. I knew that Camus had been a member of the Communist Party before the war in Algeria. So I thought, I also knew that he'd been expelled, but that was about it. So I thought communists, whether they're French, Russian or Vietnamese, have a bureaucratic passion for dossiers. They write everything, you know, they write absolutely everything. So I thought there might be something about him in Communist Party archives, not in Paris, since those archives were destroyed when the Germans arrived in 1940. The chances were very, very small because Camus was a small town communist. You know, he wasn't a Togliatti, he wasn't a Duclos. Nevertheless, I thought, well, if there are any archives about him, any archive material, they'll probably be in Moscow. So the first thing I did was to contact a very charming Russian researcher. I gave her some money and she didn't find anything, but I wasn't surprised because she didn't look for anything, so that was it. Then I wrote to the French embassy in Moscow and they said, no, there's nothing. And I finally thought, well, I'll go and have a look myself. So off I went with the help of the French Cultural Relations, blessed be them, and I went to the Comintern archives and there I found two extreme, very fat ladies who were living in a kind of limbo. The wall had fallen, and this was a post-Gorbachev era, and their philosophy seemed to be what is not absolutely forbidden is allowed. So I talked to them and they said, Mr. Todd, it was very nice of you to come here, but we've got your dossier, which gave me a bit of a shock when she said, and they said, not your dossier in the archives, your dossier as a researcher transmitted by the French embassy. And since you took the trouble of coming here, we have to repeat that there is nothing, but here are our files. Look at our files. Then things went very, very quickly. You know, when something happens, you feel like something important, you want a bit of time to elapse. And I was totally frustrated because I saw the files and I saw PCA, which means Parti Communiste Algérien. So I said, I'd like to look at that. And they brought me some files, and I had a translator, which I didn't need since everything was in French. And at one moment, I fell on the document, which I shall quote from later on. So I screamed, I just howled, and they came to find out what was happening. And so that was a very nice moment, and I had all sorts of things like that. But those are the pleasures that, historians get when they find a particularly significant document. Also, discovering unknown friends of his, people who did not belong to the Paris milieu. But I've had quite a few pleasures since. It's very rare when you write a book. I tried to keep aloof, except in my introduction and at the end. I don't always manage, but I'm vaguely under the impression that certain stupid things that was said about Camus before the war, before my private war, but you can't say them, and they don't say them anymore. The tone has gone down. People think twice before saying that Camus was an arch-colonialist or an arch-conservative. So the pleasures I had were the pleasures of
Writings
of discovery more than anything else, and the disappointments, those that you always have, is that you feel that you've never got at the bottom of things.
The people who you interviewed subsequently must have read the biography.
Yes.
And what were their response?
Well, on the whole, it was very, very favorable. Some people, I think the old guard of the Sartreans, Sartre defenders, were not totally happy about it because, put my cards on the table, I do take sides finally, but all events take sides, or, to be frank, the way I prevent events take Camus' side in that, big quarrel about totalitarianism. A couple of people were very displeased by what I wrote about them. A certain number were displeased because I didn't give them enough space, they thought. You know, Camus, to many people, was unique. And there was one lady whose name shall remain in... When I started doing this, rumors went around, and I got phone calls from ladies saying I was Camus' only and true passion. So I would say, well, that's very interesting. Do you have some correspondence? Now, if the lady said no, and said, I've got a postcard in which he says that he can't see me, I had a tendency to say, well, perhaps some other day. But there's one woman, I'm not sure that I feel guilty about her, because I think I've assessed her position correctly. Only one thing happened to her in her life. She met Camus and she had an affair with him. And then her life stopped. And she lives in a kind of shrine, you know, there's Camus everywhere. And she stopped living in 1938 when he stopped having an affair with her. And she was particularly bitter because I didn't put her photograph in with that of a few other women. Now, I'm sure that the other people think that my whole conception of Camus is wrong, but I did have pleasant surprises. I must say, for instance, without going into Parisian gossip, the first article to come out surprised me because it was in Le Monde, and I've not always been, to put it mildly, on very good terms with Le Monde, but Poirot Delpech did a huge article, excessively laudatory, and that set the ball rolling because quite a few French critics are lazy, like English or American critics, and there are few newspapers who set the tone. So on the whole, I've got nothing to complain about. I think...
I think we'd love to hear a bit about the book.
You would?
Yes.
Well, okay. Now, since I talked about the... this is an exercise which we don't have in France, you know, reading. I have never read an extract from this book, but I'll try. So this is in the 1930s, and Camus is leaving the Communist Party. Now, although Camus had not been an unconditional supporter of the Popular Front, he did pin his hopes on the Bloom-Violet plan, which allowed for 30,000 Algerians to become French citizens. And when the radical socialists in Algeria, who represented rich colonists, opposed the plan, Camus wrote a manifesto of Algerian intellectuals published on May the 2nd, 1937. The manifesto in favor of the Bloom-Violet plan appeared in the monthly bulletin of the Algerian Cultural Center with an anti-colonial message. Quote, "Culture cannot live where dignity is killed. A civilization cannot prosper under laws which crush it." Unquote. Camus said that culture could not be spoken of, quote, "in a country where 900,000 inhabitants are deprived of schooling and civilization," unquote. A French communist, Robert Deloche, advised the party about the situation in Algeria in a report that was also sent to the Comintern in Moscow. Deloche stated that it was, quote, "necessary to purge certain Trotskyite agitators such as Albert Camus, who have developed a systematic campaign of calumny against the directors of the French Communist Party and its political line." Quote. Another communist Algerian, Amar Ouzgan, was also criticized for, among other things, being, quote, "always very well dressed," unquote. And the fact that Camus too was a snappy dresser may have offended some Puritan communists. A few months later, Claude de Fréminville, the friend I mentioned 10 minutes ago, accused by the communists of printing propaganda for Messali, the Algerian nationalist leader, left the party rather than being noisily expelled. In less than 2 years, Camus had lost his wife and his political party. He was not traumatized by the break with the communists because he felt he had betrayed no one, remaining faithful to the European and Arab working classes. One immediate result of the whole affair was that he would avoid doing political theater. A few months before Camus was expelled from the Communist Party, his first book, L'Envers et l'Endroit, was printed in an edition of 350 copies. A friend of his, Jean de Maisonseul, wrote to say that he felt that Camus used the first person singular too often. And Camus replied, "I agree with you, Jean, one must remain on the sidelines." He went on to say that he had allowed himself, quote, to say everything with all my passion and a mania for nakedness of emotion, unquote, with which he finally had become disillusioned. He planned a later book with a more exterior approach, explaining, the work of art does not count for me today, even if certain pages are well written, because my heart and my flesh have written them well, and not my intelligence. Camus tried many different prose rhythms and styled in the next book, L'Envers et l'Endroit, which was received with general indifference. The Paris press did not react at all. The first review, which appeared in the Oran Républicain daily newspaper, accused Camus of mimicking Jean Grenier's prose style. After a few more articles came out, Camus told Jean de Maisonseul the same words kept recurring, like bitterness and pessimism, etc. They don't understand, and I sometimes tell myself that it's my fault that I wasn't understood. Camus by then had replaced politics with literature, as he noted in his diaries in December 1937. I quote, "Those who have grandeur inside them do not do politics." However, he remained interested in politics and wrote an essay on the 40-hour work week, which he could not get published, although it was neatly typed by Christiane Galindo, his friend and one of his first girlfriends. In the essay, Camus objected to the fact that the government had voted the 40-hour work week for laborers, but then ignored it, claiming that the 48-hour week was better for production. Incidentally, when we're discussing 35-hour work week in France, it's quite interesting. He spoke of his family without naming them. Quote, "There are entire families where the men, for example, are barrel makers, like his uncle, and the women are cleaning women, like his mother. And that's how they balance their budget. As soon as children reach the age of apprenticeship, they're put to work as well so that they'll produce something. The only historical inevitability is the one which we create. In that dangerous freedom where man finds himself alone facing the destiny he alone creates, he can find his most secret fraternity in fertile joy." In breaking with the French Communist Party, Camus had refused to compromise his feeling for the Arabs and his ideas about art to party pressures that would make political content paramount in art. If I may, I would add one sentence. Camus, I discovered, left the Communist Party and was expelled at the same time. You know, the procedure was that when you wanted to leave the party on 4th of May, they expelled you retroactively on the 1st. But what happened was that a lot of nationalists came up to him from the Messely group and said the French party has decided to soft pedal the anti-colonial struggle in Algeria. And they also added, I found no proof of that, the French communists are denouncing us to the police in Algeria. So a lot of people keep on saying that, you know, that Camus is a renegade. Now, whatever he is, I think that his reasons for leaving the Algerian Communist Party are perfectly honorable. He left that party because he thought that that party was not doing enough for what we used to call, in a somewhat supercilious colonialist way, the natives, les Kabyles et les Algériens. Now, you know, people have to be reminded of that when they look at Camus' whole voyage through politics. And I'm very happy to say this here, 2 miles from Columbia, where Professor Edward Said is, you know, writing slightly uninformed material about Camus. I remember his quote in his book. He says that Camus' sensibility was an uninformed colonial sensibility. Rubbish. You know, Camus was the first man to denounce in Kabylia what he called a regime of slavery. So I was interested in finding out, you know, what had happened, and amused to see that he got that infamous label that a lot of people got in the 30s, Trotskyite.
Camus transcended his social status or the class from which he came. That, in turn, as you pointed out earlier on, brought him to really love the use of the French language and put proper weights to words. And so it's understandable that from there it's an easy step to fall in love with the theater, but not necessarily an obvious one. What brought him to the theater, and what use did he see in the theater?
It's a long story. He started forming a group of actors in Algeria under Communist Party auspices, le Théâtre du Travail. Then when he broke up with them, he created le Théâtre de l'Équipe. And he had a very forceful personality, and he loved acting and directing. The truth is also, at the beginning of his life and at the end of his life, he liked actresses. I mean, it has to be said, you know. It's, the evidence is all there. But the first adaptation, the first two adaptations he did were very interesting. One is a collective play that he wrote with his friends about a revolt of the Asturian miners in Spain in the middle 30s, was crushed by the government. He also adapted Malraux's rather short, not very good novel. I'm quoting Malraux, who said it was a navet, turnip, you know, rubbish. And Le Temps du Mépris. And it's quite interesting that Camus, very young man, wrote to Malraux saying, can we adapt your play? And Malraux, in a very Malrussian way, just sent a telegram which said, joue, jouer, you know, act, play. Another thing I discovered when I was doing this research was the importance of Malraux in Camus' life. Now, it was sort of accepted that Jean Paulhan was the man and Queneau were the two men who got the Étranger, the novel L'Étranger, into Gallimard. It's not true. The man who got it into first is Pascal Piat, very important in Camus' life, very curious man, full of despair and honesty, and Malraux, who was one of Piat's friends. I got my hands onto the threefold correspondence during the 40 and 41 between Camus, Malraux, and Piat. And I also hit them on a totally unexpected Malraux, which probably gave me, I mean, since I've done this, I've done another small novel, and now I've embarked on a Malraux biography, so, you know, tout se tient, everything except. I discovered a Malraux I didn't suspect, you know, not the grandiose man moving among the stars and, you know, talking to Greco and Goya. I discovered a man, you know, talking business about a particular text, telling Camus, got, you know, too many short sentences, and this can be improved with punctuation. But go ahead, whatever happens, you know, this is a very, very good book.
Did Camus listen to him? Did Camus
yes,
change
he
things?
corrected a certain number of things. But also, what was quite interesting, here was Camus, totally unknown, sick, poor, living in North Africa, and Malraux was already a kind of mythical, heroic legend in the south of France during the war. And they talk on equal terms. You know, Camus says, Malraux naturally says, mon cher Camus. But Camus, as if there was nothing to it, says, mon cher Malraux. And it's very interesting to see that relationship develop. But to get back to your initial question, the theater was always very important to Camus, not only because he loved it as an art form, writing and adapting, also for personal reasons. Camus liked collective work. He liked playing football. He liked actors and actresses and directors and stagehands. He also liked journalism. And this throughout his life, He also, at one point, when he was very isolated in the 50s, hating his colleagues, les intellectuels, mes frères, as he says rather contemptuously, they were all after him, saying that he was reactionary because he criticized the communist world, saying that he was reactionary because he didn't accept Algerian independence. He took refuge among actors and actresses who didn't ask him, you know, for his political passport. And what is very interesting is that at the end of his life, he was going to get a theater that Malraux, not the Comédie Française, I mean, Malraux knew that Camus couldn't handle a big battleship like the Comédie Française, but he was going to have another cycle of producing plays, and his projects were extraordinary, you know, all sorts of Elizabethan plays, plays from the Spanish Golden Age. He was also going to commission plays for a lot of his friends, and also, which is very touching, to show you that he really liked acting. I found out that in the last months of his life, when he was writing The First Man, he had also been offered a film star job by Peter Brook, who was going to film Moderato Cantabile for Marguerite Duras. And it's anecdotal, but I think it's quite amusing. Marguerite Duras couldn't make up her mind about actors. She wanted a very improbable man, Jean-Jacques Servan-Schreiber, the editor of L'Express. Yeah. She also wanted the writer Jorge Semprún, who was, you know, perhaps the most handsome writer on the French literary scene. And she also thought of Albert Camus. And he was extremely tempted to do this, but finally he gave up, saying, I can't do it because, you know, I've got to finish this work. So what happened? Que pensez-vous qu'il arriva? Belmondo.
The excerpts we're going to read are from his play called The Misunderstanding. Camus worked on this play till the day he died, and he wrote it at a time of his life when he was in Bohemia. The play takes place in Czechoslovakia, in Bohemia. Can you tell us a little bit of where the play, how it came to be?
Well, the play is set in Bugey-le-Vicé, which is, you know, I went there, quite a charming market square, but there's nothing apart from that, in Czechoslovakia. Camus had gone to Czechoslovakia with a friend of his, an English teacher, and with his first wife, Simone Ye. And in Prague, he discovered, he knew that she was a drug addict, you know, strong on morphine and things like that. What he didn't realize is one day he went and got some mail from her, for her, at the post office, and he opened the letter by accident, it seems. And he then realized that not only was she a drug addict, but she was sleeping around with doctors to get her drug. Now, you know, when you're barely 20 and you've just got married, it's not a particularly interesting discovery. Well, if you're 40, it's not particularly interesting, but perhaps you're better armed for it. So he came back from Prague. They separated then in a very, very dark mood, very pessimistic, and he started thinking about this play, which I think is deep down very pessimistic. And I think the intrigue is interesting, but what lies below it is very interesting. And the very title, you know, can be used in all sorts of senses if you're interested in his biography. The misunderstanding, it's not only about what happens between these characters, the mother, the son, the daughter. It is also about the misunderstandings, huge misunderstanding that pertain between Camus and his wife, a woman who was after him throughout his life, you know. She pestered him constantly. And in his own way, you know, he tried to do as much as he could for them, for her.
Not at that time also, was he not dreaming, because Bohemia is a very dark place, and especially when Camus visited. And in the play, the theme of wanting sun and wanting light. Sure. And Camus was fascinated by wanting to go back to Algiers.
Yes, he had a kind of carnal, charnel relationship with Algeria throughout his life. With his wife. Throughout his wife too, because she was an extraordinarily sensual creature. But you know, the sun, the beaches, all the things that you could enjoy, even if you were poor. Throughout his life, it's a constant theme. Now, in Camus, there's a real Algeria, but there's also a mythical Algeria. We all carry around mythical country, though, because, you know, Algeria doesn't only smell of roses. You know, let's face it, you know, there's a strong smell of urine in many towns in Algeria. Now, Camus, you know, accepting that, but he remembered all the sunny, pleasant, fragrant things about Algeria, and you're quite right to point out that this is set up in, you know, a very dark country. And Camus actually loathed Czechoslovakia and Prague. You can see that in his letters. But obviously, the misadventure, to put it mildly, colored his way of looking at Bohemia. Also, in the background, there was the war that was coming up.
In the excerpt we're going to read, it's just before the end of the first act. And a stranger has come to a small inn that is, this inn is owned by a mother and daughter. And they are desperate to leave Bohemia, and they're very poor. And so the plan they've devised and come up with in the last years has been that when a stranger comes with no apparent relatives or attachment, knowing no one, they kill him, take his money, and throw him in the river. And this man has come, and the mother is now tired, but the daughter is determined to leave this country. And this is just before the end of the second act. There you are, daydreaming again, and yet we've a lot to do.
I was thinking of that man. No, really, I was thinking of myself.
You'd do better to think about tomorrow. Be positive.
That was one of your father's favorite words, I remember. But I'd like to feel sure this is the last time we'll have to be positive. It's odd. When your father used that word, it was to drive away the fear of being found out. But when you use it, it's only to quench the little spark of goodness that came into my heart.
What you call a spark of goodness is merely laziness. Look, postpone your need for rest until tomorrow, and then you'll be able to take things easy.
You're right, I know. But you must admit this traveler does not look like the others.
Yes, he's too distracted, he looks too innocent. What would the world come to if condemned men started confiding their sentimental troubles to the hangman? It's unsound as a principle. Then he's too indiscreet. He irritates me. I want to have done with it.
That, too, is unsound. In the past, we brought neither pity nor anger to our task, but the indifference that was needed. But tonight, I am tired. And you, I see, are angry. Are we obliged to go through with it? And override everything for the sake of a little more money?
No, not for money, but for a home beside the sea and forgetfulness of this country. You may be tired of living, but I am tired to death of these narrow horizons. I feel I couldn't endure another month here. Both of us are sick of this inn. You, who are too old, want no more than to shut your eyes and to forget, but I can still feel in my heart some of the desires I had when I was 20, and I want to act in such a way as to have done with them forever. Even if, for that, we must go a little further with the life we want to leave. And really, it's your duty to help me. It was you who brought me into the world, in a land of clouds and mist, instead of a land of sunshine.
Martha, I almost wonder if it wouldn't have been better for me to have been forgotten, as I was forgotten by your brother, than to hear you talk to me in that tone.
You know well, I don't mean to hurt you. What could I do without you? What would become of me if you were far away? Anyhow, I could never forget you, and if at times the strain of this life which we lead makes me fail in the respect I owe you, I beg you, Mother, forgive me.
You are a good daughter, Martha. And I can well believe that an old woman is sometimes hard to understand. But I feel the moment to tell you what I've been wanting to say all day. Not tonight!
What? Are we to wait till tomorrow? You know quite well. You've never acted like this before. You mustn't have time to meet people here. No. We must act while we have him to ourselves.
I don't know, but not tonight. Let him have this one night. Perhaps it's through him that we shall save ourselves.
Save ourselves? Why would we want to do that? And what an absurd thing to say! All you can hope for is to gain, by what you do tonight, the right to sleep.
That's what I meant, to save ourselves, to be able to sleep.
Good. Then I swear it's in our hands to work out our salvation. Mother, we must decide. Tonight, it shall be, or not at all.
Thank you very much. I must add something there. Cards on the Table. Le Malentendu is not my favorite Camus play, but I must say that if it's being performed somewhere, I'll go and have a look at it with another eye. Well, that's the point with Camus. You can go back all the time. I still think Caligula is better, but however, But
So
thank you very much. It was very...
Thank you.
On a envie de le revoir, là.
This actually brings me to my next question, because when Le Malentendu was first performed, with Maria Cazares in the lead role, it was well received.
Oh no.
No, it was badly received,
no.
very poorly received.
That's it, yes.
Yes, I'm sorry, by the press. When, as with Tennessee Williams, who we spoke of a few weeks ago in this very room, these plays are meant to be revisited, because with time also giving it distance, we find so many more meanings and layers, and as Camus was before his time, his writing as well and his understanding of human nature was maybe sometimes preceded his generation. Do you feel that Camus today still has an impact, and as strong an impact as Camus had then in his time?
What I feel is not relevant. The fact is that there's a legend which says Camus is coming back. Now what? Zorro rides again. Now, what does it mean? It means that the first man was very well received a few years ago, that my biography didn't do too badly. What people forget is that Camus may have lost the attention of certain intellectuals in Paris or London or New York, people who followed Sartre and Foucault and others. He never lost his following among readers. The figures are there, and I went through all the figures at Gallimard, and the sales of Camus. Now, I've never stopped. Now, don't misunderstand me. I don't believe that, audiomats for television, a good sign of health, or that sales automatically make a good writer. Otherwise, Sully Zer would be Shakespeare in France. But when writing has a certain quality and certain ambitions, it does mean something. Camus not only has not lost his readers in all classes of society, because that's something very interesting. You know, whenever an American student or Russian student arrives in Paris and says, I've read 5 French books, the chances of his having read L'Étranger are very, very high. For good reasons, because it's interesting, for bad reasons, because it's short. But in all classes, it's short, it's easy to read, not necessarily easy to understand. But generations after generations have renewed themselves. And what is particularly interesting is to see that behind the so-called Iron Curtain and the Bamboo Curtain, of which there is still quite a bit, people have always liked Camus. I mean, 3 years ago, I went to lecture in Budapest on Camus, and a writer, a very good writer called Georgi Konrad, when we had dinner afterwards, said, you know, when we came to France in the 50s, early 50s, we could never understand why so many people of the so-called intelligentsia, you know, there is the word intelligent in intelligentsia, followed Sartre, when we knew that deep down Camus was right about what went on behind the curtain. We lived through that every day. And as you know, Hungary was not the worst of the socialist countries. So I think one has to be very careful. He never lost his following. He lost the attention of people. The trouble about intellectuals is that once they get hold of a wrong idea, they'll claw to it to the bitter end. Now, you know, a peasant or a worker, if something goes wrong in his factory or in his field, you know, if the worker sees that the machine has conked out, he'll try and repair it. The peasant, if he hits a stone, he'll either try to go around it or remove the stone. Not Paris intellectuals, no, 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 you know. The more we discovered about what went on behind the curtain, the more Sartre's dialectical virtuosity went in to explain what goes on. And I'm sorry, but one has to remind, his talent and his genius put aside, that Sartre in the 50s came back from Russia and signed interviews in which he said that no one was freer in the world than a Russian intellectual. You know, this is a direct quote. And he kept on saying that we were responsible for what happened in the Soviet Union, and that there was a dialectical movement between what the capitalist world did to the communist world. Well, Camus, with far less mental agility, but much more sense, more intuition, actually refused to be told that it was night when it was full daylight. He refused to accept that means always justify ends. He refused the millennium. And today, a lot of things he said seem perfectly obvious and simple. But you have to go back to the 1950s, and you have to go back to French education. He not only criticized in L'Homme Révolté, the Russian Revolution, he also criticized certain aspects of the French Revolution. He did not believe, as we all did when we were school children in the lycées, brought up on a diet of Mallet and Isaac, that, you know, all French revolutionaries, Danton, Robespierre, and Saint-Just, were really very, very great men. He said perhaps they were also bloodthirsty. And before the new historians like François Furet and others, he said that there were in the French Revolution certain aspects that might be slightly questionable. Now, in the 90s and before the year 2000, all of this seems to be obvious. But he had to live through being pointed at as a renegade. His last 10 years, Nobel Prize or no Nobel Prize, were lived in solitude for Camus.
And this brings us to the last extract of the play, and then we'll be followed by a question and answer if you want to ask Monsieur Todd some questions about Camus. And in the same vein as Monsieur Todd was saying of how Camus saw and understood things that seem obvious to us today and certainly at the time were revolutionary and could not be understood. In the Misunderstanding, what he says of human nature, we have since discovered is very much part of the fabric of our lives, but at that time where one never spoke of one's deepest desires. They must have seemed very crude and nearly impossible. When we, what the excerpt we're going to talk about in the play is at the starting to the end of the play, the daughter has now done the deed. And her mother has come to the room where this man is lying, and they will prepare the body, stealing the wallet, taking anything of value out of his pockets, and of which his passport. And
Throwing him in the river.
and throwing him in the river. He's asleep.
No, Martha. I dislike having my hand forced like this. I'm being dragged into this act. You started so that I have no chance of drawing back. I don't like your way of trampling over my hesitation.
As you couldn't make up your mind, it was right for me to help you by taking the first step.
I know it had to come to that. All the same, I don't feel pleased about it.
Come on, Mother. Think of tomorrow instead. And let's get busy. There. Everything's ready. Very soon the river waters will have risen fully. Let's go downstairs. We'll come back and get him once we hear the water flowing over the dam. Come.
No. Let's sit down.
But please don't think it frightens me. Let's wait here, then.
Yes. Let's wait. Waiting is good. Waiting is restful. Later we'll have to carry him all the way down to the river. The mere thought of it makes me tired. With a tiredness that has lasted so long. And so long that my old blood can't cope with it. Meanwhile, this man has no suspicion. He's asleep. He's through with the world. Everything will be easy for him.
Let's rejoice. Then. I had no reason for hating him. And I'm glad he's being spared any pain. But it seems the waters are rising. Mother, oh, Mother, everything will be over soon.
Yes, everything will be over. The waters are rising. Meanwhile, he suspects nothing. He's asleep. He sleeps, he has done with the anxiety of making decisions, with thoughts of work that must be done. And I, old and tired as I am, I envy him for sleeping now and for dying later. You're not saying anything, Mother.
I'm listening. I'm waiting for the roar of the waves.
In a moment. In only a moment. Just another moment in which at least happiness is still possible.
Happiness will come after, not before.
Tell me, Martha, did you know that he meant to leave this evening?
No, I didn't, but if I'd known, it wouldn't have changed anything. Once I had made up my mind.
He told me just now, and I didn't know what to answer him.
So you went to see him?
Yes. I came here to stop him drinking the tea, but it was too late.
Yes, it was too late. And if you must know, it was he who made up my mind for me. I was hesitating, but he started telling me about those countries where I have always wanted to go, and by working on my feelings, hardened my heart against him.
Yet, Martha, he'd come to understand. He told me he felt this house was not his home.
Of course! Of course this house is not his home. For that matter, it's nobody's home. No one will ever find warmth or comfort in this house. Had he realized that sooner he'd have been spared, and spared us too, he would have spared our having to teach him that this room is made for sleeping in, and this life is made for dying in. Enough of this now. Listen. The water's flowing over the dam. Come, Mother. Let's get it over with.
Very well, Martha. But I have a feeling that tomorrow's dawn will never come.
Shortly after this, they read his passport and discover that this stranger was in fact her son and my brother. The play will be done at Ubu Rep in starting February 3rd. Françoise, this is our director. And you are all very, very welcome to come and see it. It's a wonderful piece. If anyone has any questions for Monsieur Todd, here, over here, yes?
Camus was considered by many to be an existentialist, but apparently he didn't himself consider him part of that group. There seems to be a current theme among many people. Wittgenstein didn't consider himself to be a logical positivist. Many people who are parts of groups that they don't consider themselves.
Yeah, well, I don't think you can compare Wittgenstein and Camus. Wittgenstein was a really professional philosopher. I don't think Camus was. Dieu merci. Let me expand on that. He was not a professional philosopher. He was not a philosopher in the sense in which Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Wittgenstein, Russell, or Hegel are. This does not mean that he did not produce some important ideas in the philosophy of history or in politics. I think that in L'Homme Révolté there are 50 pages. I don't find it an entirely satisfactory book because in a very French manner he mixes, literature, philosophy, politics. I think he would probably have done better and been better understood if he'd done a very short book on the central theme, which really got Sartre's goat, which is revolution, violence, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, the Girondins and the Montagnards. Camus is not a philosopher and is not an existentialist. Now, when he wrote Le Mythe de Sisyphe, he didn't even use the word existentialist, which makes one think of something rather ponderous. He says, les existentiels, the existentials, it's a bit more like a butterfly. And Camus and Sartre, of course, rapped him on the knuckles. I quote Sartre, quoting books you've not read, etc., etc., etc. Now, that being said, Camus was a bit coquettish about it, or he misunderstood himself. Because in his correspondence, he does say to Christian Galindo, when he's going to finish Le Mythe de Sisyphe, I'm going back to philosophy. But he was very, and then it's only during the Nobel Prize conversation in Stockholm that he said, yes, I don't know why I insisted on being sometimes called a philosopher. But he very quickly said, I'm not an existentialist. He could have also added, had he been totally lucid, nor am I a philosopher in at least the traditional French sense. But the mistake is made over and over again, labels like old soldiers never die. I mean, we keep on saying and seeing it, and not simply in the popular press. But I am very happy that Camus didn't get. Just imagine, he could have been an agrégé de philosophie, and had forgotten to write his books and plays. That being said, he had a chip on his shoulder about it. The relationship between Camus and Sartre is very interesting, but I don't want to expand on that now. It's a very long, very interesting problem. But the fact that Sartre was very haughty. The first article he wrote on Camus was called Explication de l'étranger. Explanation of l'étranger. In other words, young man, I'm going to tell you exactly what you think when you get old. And he did, saying you're no good as a philosopher, 1 out of 20, but you're a marvelous writer. That is actually how the relationship ended in the quarrel of Révolté. Sartre, who's playing games and enjoying the fight, which, the literary fight, which Camus isn't. Sartre says, okay, you were a very good writer, but as a thinker, as a philosopher, curiously, Sartre equates thinker with philosopher. Questionable. He says, you're no philosopher at all. He's extremely rude to Camus. He even says, you should read Being in Nothingness, my own little masterpiece. You should read Hegel. But of course, you're much too lazy. You couldn't, you wouldn't. And he says, I'm quoting, at least Hegel and myself will have one point in common, which is that you will never have read either of us. Hegel et moi auront au moins ceci de commun, vous ne nous aurez lu ni l'un ni l'autre.
There's a question here.
Well, first of all, I have to say that I have lost a day to a day and a half's worth of work because I picked up your book and I couldn't really put it down.
No refunds.
And the animated and passionate investigation that you've done into this man's work is something that I'm very grateful for. Having said that, I was also grateful.
Catch-22 now.
I was also grateful for growing up that my jackets had 2 pockets in them when I grew up, because in one pocket would be the myth of Sisyphus and the other pocket would be the rebel, and I was armed against convention and the establishment. And I wonder if the people in the university of today feel that same sense of camaraderie towards that work. I know that you said that there's a sense of the reinvestigation of Camus, but do you think that there is that sense of allegiance that people pay towards his work?
I find that question very difficult to answer. With people in the university, what universities? The fact is that a lot of, in important fields, like history, sociology, demography, whatever, I find that people are neither interested for their work in Sartre or Camus. The shares are down. From a literary point of view, it's a completely different story. But if one talks to the younger generation, very well educated, there is a kind of feeling of camaraderie towards Camus. There's a feeling that this chap is honest. And to use my worn-out metaphor, you couldn't make him say that it was daylight, in the middle of the night. There's a sense that Sartre got away with a lot of things. Perhaps I know the wrong people, but I don't find that Sartre is being mentioned a lot by historians or...
Whereas Camus is.
Well,
Camus
is,
a
yes.
bit more, not because they think, that he's a researcher full of genius, but because they feel that with his gut feelings, he got to the truth
He's human.
much more quickly, and he suffered for it. Once more, this terrible man called Aragon, who was quite talented nevertheless, used to have this sentence, il faut regarder alors avec les yeux d'alors. You have to look at those days with the eyes of those days. It's very easy to say today, well, of course Camus was right about the Gulag and the failures of Marxism and the positive aspects of Marx's analysis. Easy in 1998, but in 1950s, you must remember the climate, the terroristic climate that actually existed in the Communist Party, had 35% of the votes, or 30%. And historiography, as Curie and people like that, in their witness, was occupied by Marxists, who were not only Marxists, but were very often members of the Communist Party. And here was Camus, alone. Not alone in the sense that other people felt like him. He was not the first to discover the Gulag, and he could have discovered before. But I think it's fair to say that he was the well-known French writer who stood his ground then.
And who denounced.
And, who said quite clearly, I cannot agree, I cannot go along with this. He said something which seemed extraordinary in those days. The Sartreans accused him of being on the right because right-wing papers had approved of his book. What an argument. And he said, well, if I happened to find out that the truth was on the right, I would be on the right. So the last words that Camus said about his relationship to the left, whatever that means today, was very interesting. He gave a lecture and a Q&A session to foreign students in Aix a couple of weeks before he died. And someone said to him, and what about the left? How do you feel about the left? And he thought it out. I saw someone who saw that, and he said, well, I still feel, however isolated he was, that I belong to it. And he said, malgré elle et malgré moi, notwithstanding that left and notwithstanding myself. And I think that's the way he died. But he died a very lonely man.
We have time for one more question.
Yes, I have one here.
Yes.
Monsieur Todd, you've been published both sides of the Atlantic in 2 languages. In France, your biography was twice as long as it is over here. What are your thoughts about that?
I hope someone wouldn't raise that question.
I've raised it.
Okay, well, the answer is, I won't give you the details of, the contractual. Oh, I did. Well, I tell you what, yes, I will. This is not, publication. We're among friends now.
A few 100,000 friends.
With the television crew, we're never among friends. When they've stopped shooting, I will tell you the details if you're interested. I think that, my English and I'm sure that my English and American publishers now agree that, mistakes were made and this went through a bit too quickly in the English version. I prefer the French version, and
But
there we are. These things happen, but I'm quite prepared to discuss the details. There's nothing that anybody has to be ashamed of. It was a long series of misunderstandings. Thank you very much.
Just if we could, I just wanted to finish this one thought. If we could say that that Camus had a visceral dialogue with the truth, and if we could say that Sartre had sort of a dispassionate commentary on the truth, if that's true, how does that? Is that also exemplified in the differences in their relationship to women?
Oof, that's a big jump. No, I wouldn't say that. I think that coming from the working class, the Pieds Noirs were working class. Camus never had the chip on his shoulder that Sartre had, who was constantly fighting not to be a bourgeois. Not that there's anything wrong with being a bourgeois. The bourgeoisie did carry culture throughout the ages. And Sartre always wanted to outdo people on their left. Camus didn't feel that he had to. But it's true that Sartre was a prodigiously agile mind, and he could, explain everything and the content in the same move. Mm-hmm. And not Camus. Camus moved more slowly, but I think with his eyes and ears open, not Sartre. Once more get back to this intellectual syndrome. if you're wrong, you're going to be wrong, and there are all sorts of reasons for it. God knows that Sartre could find a reason. Now, for women, it's an entirely different subject. I don't see any dialectics in it. What I do know, what it does seem to me, is I once liked Sartre very, very much as a man. I was grateful to him for all sorts of reasons. But the more I find out about him as a man, the more disappointed I am.
Yeah.
I think Sartre loved humanity, but not that much individual men and women.
Mm-hmm.
I think Camus liked men and women very much before he loved humanity. It's a caricatural way of saying it, but to cut a long story, and Sartre and Camus and women is a very long story. I understand that there's a lady here who's going to write a book on Camus and women, and she's welcome, but it's going to be a long ride. But from what I know, from what I witnessed, I think that Camus had a much more equalitarian relationship with women. He was a Pygmalion to Catherine Sellers and to me, his last young love, who's still alive and still very beautiful. Sartre, apart from Simone de Beauvoir, Dangerous Ground was 25 times more the macho than Camus was. Much more. And somehow, the more we know about their private correspondence, the more uncomfortable I feel about Sartre's relationship with women. And not that Camus was exemplary, he left lots of women in tears here and there, but on the whole, I think he had a very interesting and full relationship with the women. Yeah. All right. So, like Jacques Cormery, the hero of Le Premier Homme, when he was killed in a ridiculous car accident, there were 4 women in his life. All right, so there were 4 women in his life, plenty of men in Paris, and I'm sure New York were 4 women in their house.
That's right.
Sometimes more.
Yeah.
The book has been extraordinarily well reviewed and received by the New York Times. Yes, the French version reads a good 800 pages, and this book has a little over 400, but we're told it at least respects the essence, and we hope, of what you were trying to convey about Camus, your love of Camus and your respect for him. And in French you say le mot de la fin, and so what would be, for you, what do you retain of Camus as a man, as a writer?
Well, and very often writers, we all know, are inferior to their work as men. In The Plague, Camus says that when all is said and done, there is more to admire than to be contemptuous of in man in general. Il y a plus à admirer qu'à mépriser en l'homme. And, after living with him for 5 years, I think this is still true.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
No, I think it's going to be in the next room. Let me just check with Karen, okay? Are the books you set up in the next room?
She set them up upstairs. She asked me to help get people.
Okay. Okay.
In a minute, Susanna Lessard discusses her book, The Architect of Desire. It's about her great-grandfather, architect Stanford White, and American cultural life at the turn of the 20th